With the nasty barbs, the explosive rhetoric, and sucker punches to personality, Conservatives are lining up behind 6 potential candidates to lead them out of the opposition and into government. Which way they go? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. Animosity is driving the bus in the Conservatives' largest leadership race ever. More than 400,000 memberships have been sold, according to the party leadership committee, with the closing deadline of today. 6 candidates in all looking to lead the party into the next election, with Carleton MP Pierre Poilievre siphoning off most of the air in the room. Former Quebec Premier Charest is on that list, along with former Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown, former leadership candidate Leslyn Lewis. She's in the ring, along with former Ontario MPP Roman Babar and current Conservative MP Scott Aitchison. 2 debates are behind us, with the leadership convention set for September in Ottawa. Our Unpublished.vote question asks you, which candidate will the Conservatives select? Pierre Poilievre, Charest, Leslyn Lewis, Patrick Brown, Roman Babar, or Scott Aitchison? You can log on and vote right now at Unpublished.vote and have your voice heard. Coming up on the Unpublished Cafe, we'll chat with Laurie Williams of Mount Royal University, David Coletto of Abacus Data, and Nelson Wiseman, Professor Emeritus at the U of T. But first, I'm pleased to be joined by Jack Jedwab, President of the Association of Canadian Studies. And, Jack, 2 debates so far, 1 in French in Quebec, several of the candidates struggling in the French language. How big of a liability is that for them?
It's certainly going to be a bit of a liability for those candidates who aren't able to communicate effectively in French. The Conservative base, which I think is principally outside of the Montreal area, at least in terms of who's part of that party in Quebec, is certainly going to look for someone who is able to communicate at least minimally in French. And so that's certainly going to be a factor. And either way, I think as far as Quebec's concerned, it's going to come down to Monsieur Poilievre and Mr. Charest.
With the point system for the 338 ridings, how big a part do Quebecers play in this race?
They'll play I think everyone's going to play a significant part in this race, one way or the other, in terms of every vote counting, unless, one candidate seems to be pulling away too far. If that should be the case, then, the regional distribution won't matter as much. But, I think every vote risks counting. And at this point will depend on, in terms of the 400,000 people, what the sort of orientation is of the vast majority of that group. And to the extent that the party sees itself as losing support, at least in the big picture, not in terms of the leadership race per se, to the People's Party of Canada, and wants to recover some of the losses that they've suffered from the gains of the People's Party of Canada. If that's what the base looks like, it certainly will favor Mr. Poilievre going towards the leadership decision.
Was Charest jumping into the race a bit of surprise to you? And if so, why?
Yeah, it was a bit of a surprise to me. I would have thought that at this point, given his political involvement from his leadership of the federal Conservatives and his longstanding as a cabinet minister member of the Conservatives, and then going on to Quebec, where he assumed the leadership of the Liberal Party and became premier of the province. He's had a really long political career and really positive, I would say, overall in terms of the outcome. But I guess he's decided that he hasn't had enough yet, and he wants another try and wants to pursue his dream of being prime minister, one that he certainly had before he ended up assuming the leadership of the Liberals and going on to be premier of Quebec.
Now, this leadership race has been fairly nasty. Have you seen a nastier one, and do you expect it's going to get worse?
I suspect. Well, I've seen nastier campaigns before. They're. I mean, in Canada, we are known for being more polite, but we are seeing more of that populist effect, and we see those very nasty campaigns south of our border. And clearly, there's some, I think, resemblance in terms of that type of nasty campaign in terms of what we're seeing here. And the Conservatives, by and large, and especially those on the more right-wing side of the Conservative Party, do have a bit of affinity for the type of politics you see in the U.S. So I wouldn't be surprised that we see some of the same slugfest that we see in the U.S. Replicated here in the Conservative campaign. And we've seen a bit of it already in those first 2 leadership debates and the fallout after those debates in terms of what's being said. Mr. Poilievre Doesn't seem to say as much in the aftermath of those debates. It's Mr. Charest, who's clearly right now needing to do a lot of catch up, is probably going to have to continue to throw a lot more barbs at Mr. Poilievre.
Are Quebecers paying attention to this campaign?
I would say. I think those people who are more engaged with it are paying attention in the Conservative ranks, and much will depend on what happens in the provincial election. We're heading to a provincial election here, and that's certainly going to be far more the object of people's attention here in Quebec than the federal campaign for the time being. The provincial election will take place after the leadership is decided. But still, there's going to be risk being some intersection between the two, because the provincial campaign will get underway as that federal leadership campaign is decided. So expect there to be some intersection. There's more affinity on the, I think, CAQ, Coalition Avenir Quebec side in terms of where their base is relative to the Conservatives federally. So, and you can see already Mr. Charest in terms of Mr. Legault, Premier Legault's demand for repatriating immigration powers is already sort of sending some positive signals, as will Mr. Poilievre have, if he hasn't done so already, do much the same. So I would suspect that that will certainly create a bit of that intersectional interest, if you like, between the provincial election campaign and the federal leadership campaign.
Jack, I want to thank you for joining us.
No problem, Ed. My pleasure. You have a good weekend.
Jack Jedwab is the president of the Association of Canadian Studies. At this point in the leadership race, Pierre Poilievre is the frontrunner by a large margin. His campaign has been unique with his firebrand rhetoric about gatekeepers, elites, and freedom. Nelson Wiseman is professor emeritus in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, and he joins us now. And Nelson, when you look at the candidates, is there enough variety in ideas, or is this just driven by personality?
I think it's both. I think there is variety, and I think there is personality. I mean, in terms of variety, the differences between Jean Charest and, let us say, Scott Aitchison on one side and Pierre Poilievre on the other are quite dramatic. And in fact, a lot of the differences between Patrick Brown and Poilievre are different, and certainly between Charest and Leslyn Lewis. So there are policy differences. When it comes to personalities, there are great differences there too, in terms of their style and the way they relate to each other. We've had pointed personal attacks, fiery verbal exchanges, charges of hypocrisy, of law breaking, of illegal activity. That isn't in the older tradition of Canadian politics, and certainly not in leadership races.
Do the Conservatives run the risk of alienating voters, though, with all the vitriol in this campaign?
Voters have a very short attention span. Mm-hmm. So whoever becomes the leader, I think if and when we get to an election, which may not happen for another 3 years, nobody will be talking about this. But voters are getting impressions now of the candidates, especially Poilievre, because he's the front runner. And so he's getting a lot of ink, a lot of face time in media, and he's been in Parliament, which is what we can't say about Patrick Brown or Jean Charest. Jean Charest is known to an older generation of Canadians. So although the media are very familiar with him and write about him, to a lot of people, he's ancient history.
And is that a help or a hindrance for him?
Well, it can be either. In this case, because remember, when we're talking about voters, we're only talking about select members of the Conservative Party who are eligible to vote. And I believe the culture and the membership of the Conservative Party has shifted ideologically in Poilievre's direction. Remember, Charest was leader of the old Progressive Conservative Party. It doesn't exist anymore because although we like to think that it merged with the Canadian Alliance, and Poilievre comes out of that tradition. It was actually acquired by the Reform Party and the Canadian Alliance. And that's where the culture is. Also, because of the dynamic that developed around the pandemic, specifically vaccination, which has become a polarizing issue in the leadership race, as it was in last year's federal election. And Charest is clearly on one side, and Poilievre and others like Leslyn Lewis and Babber are on the other side.
You brought up Scott Aitchison a little while ago, and I found it a little surprising he jumped in, and his first priority, I remember mentioning, was talking about Quebec and Bill 96. Did you find that a bit of a strange look?
Well, what I found strange is that I agree with you, is throwing his hat into the ring. I didn't think he'd be able to raise the money, just as a number of other prospective candidates weren't able to. I don't have a strong sense of him. I mean, he seems very reasonable and wants to stress unity of the party. With respect to Bill 96, this bill doesn't have the same traction, I believe, in the rest of Canada outside of Quebec as Bill 21 does, which deals with religious symbols worn by public officials, because that's seen as a matter of freedom of religion. In the case of language, I believe a lot of English Canadians have already, in many ways, dissociated themselves or resigned themselves to the politics of Quebec, and they recognize that this is simply catering to a nationalist impulse, which is, shall I say, paranoid about the status of French in Quebec.
Mm-hmm. You know, from what we've seen so far in this campaign, how is it different from, say, the previous one, Aaron O'Toole and Maxime Bernier, or even going back, Brian Mulroney when he upended Joe Clark?
Every leadership race is distinct. It's unique. History moves on. It's constantly moving, so that the goalposts change. And also, most importantly, the context is completely different. So talking about the Mulroney-Clark contest is to talk about a party that doesn't exist anymore, the old Progressive Conservative Party. And it came it completely different. It's much easier to compare what's going on now to what happened with Aaron O'Toole's election and Andrew Scheer's election, because they've all happened in the recent past. So the big division, if I recall, between O'Toole and Bernier was over supply management, which is really why O'Toole won, because although Bernier was from Quebec, where supply management has, well, I think it's got the largest proportion of farmers, at least dairy farmers, they rallied to, they joined O'Toole's campaign, and that defeated Bernier. That was the division there. It was before the pandemic, but it also led to the creation of the People's Party. When we go back to Scheer, the dynamic was similar. I mean, Bernier, hang on, O'Toole didn't defeat Bernier. Bernier had the People's Party, I believe, already. I'm trying to now even think about who O'Toole defeated in second place. But that division was clear with Scheer, Bernier and Scheer, and then we had Bernier breaking off. Do you remember, Ed, who O'Toole defeated?
I could have sworn that was Bernier. But okay, moving on here for a second.
You know, this is a very good point. We're both political junkies, and it shows how attention span is so brief. But I'll tell you what is different between the O'Toole victory in that leadership campaign and the Scheer victory. Comparing those two, how they're similar and how they're different from this one. In both those cases, at the end of the day, O'Toole and Scheer won on the last ballot. And in both cases, The difference were the social conservatives in the party, the ones that were opposed to abortion or to a positive or favorable outlook at gays. And that's different this time. Now, Leslyn Lewis ran third last time. Again, I don't remember who ran second, but that made the difference. And it also made the difference when Scheer won, when he defeated Bernier. So this time, that isn't as clear yet. I don't think Lewis will be, but I think this will happen. I think the Lewis people on their second choice and the Baber people will swing to Poilievre as their second choice, whereas I think the Aitchison and Brown people will swing to Charest. Alternatively, if Brown comes second, I expect Charest supporters to look more favorably at Brown than at Poilievre, but don't underestimate Poilievre's support in Quebec, because there is a strong anti-vax group there. It's small, but it's very determined, and many showed up at the French language debate among the leadership candidates.
You know, considering what we saw with the Ontario election results last night, with the Conservatives basically eating the Liberals' lunch, and, well, this being the most populous province, do you expect a change in direction for the federal Conservative leadership race then?
No.
No,
I don't.
Okay.
I don't see a connection between the federal. A lot of people are quick to draw ties between the federal and provincial parties, Liberal, Conservative, and so on. And I think sometimes there are strong ideological links. I mean, I would have said between O'Toole and Kenny, when O'Toole was complimenting Kenny on how he handled the pandemic, disastrously as it turned out. But we haven't seen much ideological affinity between the Ontario Conservatives, as led by Ford in the last year, and the federal Conservatives. Look at vaccination, the big differences, and lockdowns, and the trucker convoy. I mean, we had Ford who declared a provincial emergency before the feds did, and became critical of the truckers, whereas Poilievre was palling with them.
Nelson, I want to thank you for joining us. Very interesting perspective.
Thank you, Ed.
Nelson Wiseman's Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. As mentioned off the top, Pierre Poilievre is leading the federal Conservative leadership race by a fair-sized margin. But is he bulletproof? David Coletto is the CEO of Abacus Data, and he joins us now. And David, Poilievre was first in the race and had a fairly mercurial rise to the top of the candidates. Can he flame out too early?
I think there's always a risk that happens. We've seen it actually in the last two leadership races where, front runners didn't end up winning, and, folks below them kind of surprised us by, pulling together second and third choices. But there's no doubt, as you said, he is still the favorite. He is still the most liked of the leaders among those that would support the Conservative Party. But in some of our recent tracking, we've noticed for the first time his negatives are going up and his positives are going down. And I think it's a reflection of the debate that he starts himself by throwing out, what some would consider controversial ideas and letting them become the focus of the campaign. And so as a result, we've seen his negatives double. He's nowhere near in, I think, danger zone, but he went from 7% of those who would vote Conservative having a negative view of him up to 14. So it's a noticeable shift, and one that, if it were to continue, could suggest he might be vulnerable, and an anybody but Pierre campaign could develop.
Bruce Anderson with Abacus as well mentioned the potential voter pool for them is shrinking. Why is that, and what's the impact?
Well, one of the things we don't know is how big the membership's going to be who are ultimately going to decide this. And we'll see that in the next few weeks as I think today actually is the last day to sign up new members. But, every time I think a candidate of any party, of any stripe, throws out ideas and becomes the focus of pretty intense criticism, that's going to have an effect on those open to voting for you. And I think in the Conservative leadership race, which is often the case in Conservative leadership races, but in many parties, the choices that voters and members are being asked to make are, which of these candidates do I like the most? Do I agree with the most? It gets me excited. But also, which of these candidates can actually win? And for a party that's been out of power now for 3 straight elections, I think the interplay between those two factors is going to be important. And so what Pierre Poilievre has done, I think, by being as controversial and doubling down, right? He's not shying away from these positions, is perhaps raising more questions about his electability, which is the fundamental argument that Jean Charest and Patrick Brown, his 2 primary opponents, are making about themselves and Pierre Poilievre in terms of his inability, perhaps, to get elected.
I look at your numbers that, Poilievre leads among, Conservative Party members, but, Charest is the preferred one among Canadians. How does he work that, Charest, into his favor?
Well, it's a hard one. And I think he's been trying to, because despite the fact that Pierre Poilievre has seen his negatives go up, Jean Charest remains the least popular of the candidates running among Conservative supporters. About a quarter of them say, I don't have a favorable view of him, I have a negative view. And so his challenge remains convincing people who might otherwise not like him, not see him as one of them, right? Convincing them not only should they maybe plug their nose and vote for him, but that because he can win an election, and trying to rebalance the scale in terms of that being the most important factor, right? So I do still think Charest has a very challenging road to win the leadership, in part because so many of the Conservative base, and I suspect among Conservative members it's even more so, don't view him favorably, and I think there's a lot of they view him they're suspect that he may not be one of them, as Pierre Poilievre himself has tried to paint that liberal logo all over Mr. Charest and reminding people that he was the Liberal Premier of Quebec.
He's not one of them, but that sort of shows division in a sense, right? And Pierre Poilievre isn't one of them to the other side. So how does this party work it out?
That's the big question, right? I have never seen as divisive an internal party debate as the one we've seen over the last few months. These candidates have called themselves names, unqualified to be, an MP, let alone the leader of a party or prime minister, right? And so they've undermined each other so much that you can't imagine. I don't think you can imagine Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Charest sitting in the same caucus working closely together. And that suggests to me that might extend to those that support them and those either in caucus or in otherwise. So I think whoever wins this leadership, and it's still, I think, likely to be Mr. Poilievre, the question then becomes, can he bring the party together? Can you unify it? Because what we've seen over the last 8 years, basically, is a divided Conservative Party who hasn't been able to keep a leader for very long. And those internal battles continue to be its primary Achilles heel. And initial indications are that it's not going away, and this leadership race is making it worse, not better.
When you figure Ed Fast resigned because he wasn't keen on a lot of Poilievre policies, I don't see how somebody who's a little bit moderate on the Conservative side sort of sidling up to Poilievre after the fact.
I agree. I think people will remember how they were treated during these days, and someone with Mr. Fast's experience, he was a cabinet minister, he was finance critic, just as you said to a few days ago, to feel so compelled and so treated so poorly by somebody who's likely to become the leader of his party suggests that you may have some incumbents who decide not to run again or who choose not to sit. I think, I'm speculating too much here, but I think given the animosity in this race, you'd have to expect there's going to be hard feelings, and those hard feelings are going to be hard to overcome in a short period of time.
David, I want to thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure, Ed. Take care.
David Coletto is the CEO of Abacus Data. The federal Conservative leadership campaign has a fair amount of road ahead and the potential for a candidate to hit the ditch before the finish line. Laurie Williams is an associate professor in the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies at Mount Royal University, and she joins us now. And Laurie, which candidate, in your view, benefits from the length of this campaign?
Pierre Poilievre clearly has, just because he got out in front and started campaigning from the beginning, has a lot more sort of momentum going into this race. The others have been playing catch up. That said, though, the other candidates, given that there's a fairly long campaign to make up that difference, but unfortunately, they're going to try to do it over the summer, and that could be quite tricky. So we've got the deadline for actually becoming a member is now passed or passing, and so it's now is trying to appeal to the folks that are already on those lists.
How much do you think this campaign is going to define the Conservative Party?
Well, it looks like a fight for what the Conservative Party of Canada is, and there are very different visions being put forward here between those frontrunners, Pierre Poilievre and Jean Charest. It's very interesting that Poilievre is clearly campaigning to the right in many ways, in a populist campaign, opposed to vaccinations, raising questions about institutions and elites and so forth. And Jean Charest is pointing to the dangers associated with that. What I find really interesting is looking at the results of the Ontario election. We see the most successful Conservative leader in Canada since Stephen Harper is Ford, and the reason is because he's not particularly ideological. He kicked folks out of his cabinet for opposing vaccine mandates and questioning healthcare policies. He worked with the Liberals, which I think is indicative of what a lot of Canadians want to see politicians do to them. Which level of government is at work? What's important to them is that the different levels of governments they voted for work together to try to solve the very real problems Canadians are facing.
You know, a lot's been made about the divide of Canadians regionally, and you know the formula for deciding this race, with each riding worth 100 points. Do you see it inflaming the division more, or maybe toning it down? You know, I'm thinking that Quebec has twice as much sway as Alberta would in this race.
Yeah, I do think that could benefit some candidates, Charest in particular, and could disadvantage. But having said that, it's important to remember that Charest started his campaign in Alberta, so I think he's very aware of the fact that he doesn't want to look like he's come in or won their way. He wants to ensure that his appeal spans the entire country. And the reality is, in Canada, the vast majority of the population is in central Canada. And those votes are going to affect who becomes leader, who becomes prime minister. Policies are pursued. And we've seen, several leaders come out of Alberta who've had to govern for the entire country when they were prime minister. And that's just a reality of Canadian politics.
Yeah, Poilievre is a freight train right now. Do you think he's unstoppable?
Well, I think it's quite clear he's well ahead and very difficult to catch. He's behaving as though he doesn't care or think that there's going to be a second ballot, that he's going to win on the first ballot, and he's not apparently trying to court candidates or the voters for other candidates along the way. So it's just a question of whether Jean Charest is successful in calling attention to some of the issues that will be important going into the next election. Again, we've seen Conservative Party leaders nationally campaign a little to the right in a more populist direction when it came to the leadership, and had to pivot more to the center in order to try to win votes across the country. And the question becomes whether Poilievre is going to be given the somewhat extreme views that he is associating himself with.
But that seems to be the problem with the Conservatives in terms of leaders. When it comes to the race for leadership, yeah, you mentioned they tacked right, and then they try to go to the middle to get more people, and then we're back to a division again.
Well, the divisions don't go away. They tend to sort of fall off the radar when Conservatives do well in elections and polls, and when those polls don't look quite, the factions sort of split open again. But it's really important to understand that Conservative parties in Canada, certainly in Alberta and at the federal level, are coalitions of very distinct parties with people that have very different views, that oppose one another, that even dislike one another. And because of all of those different factions and the dissonance between and amongst those factions, the incompatibility of some of the demands that they're making, it's extremely difficult to govern one of these parties. Now, Stephen Harper showed one strategy for doing that, and that was on communication within the party, say what he would consider publicly and what he wouldn't. He persuaded members that this was the path to electoral victory, and once he won elections, he had less trouble trying to keep those factions under control. It's much more difficult for a leader and is tanking in the polls.
Laurie, I want to thank you for joining us.
It was my pleasure, as always, Ed.
Laurie Williams is an associate professor in the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies at Mount Royal University. Our Unpublished.vote question asks you, which candidate will the Conservatives select as the next leader? Pierre Poilievre, Jean Charest, Leslyn Lewis, Patrick Brown, Roman Baber, or Scott Aitchison? You can log on and vote right now at Unpublished.vote. I want to thank our guest today, Jack Jedwab of the Association of Canadian Studies, Nelson Wiseman at the U of T, David Coletto of Abacus Data, and Laurie Williams at Mount Royal University. And I want to thank you for watching the Unpublished Cafe. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.